In a world obsessed with wealth, fame, and power, there once lived a man who owned nothing, not even shame. His name was Diogenes of Cynic, and he laughed at the world that took itself too seriously. He rejected comfort, mocked kings, and lived in a barrel. But behind his wild appearance and biting humor lay one of the most radical philosophies in human history, a philosophy that asked a simple but devastating question: what does it mean to live freely? Diogenes was born in the 4th century BCE in the Greek city of Cynic. He arrived in Athens at a time when philosophers like Plato were building systems of reason and idealism. But Diogenes wanted none of it. He believed that philosophy had become too complicated, too comfortable, and too distant from real life. So he tore it down, not with arguments, but with actions. His philosophy wasn't written in books, it was lived through defiance. He belonged to the Cynic school of philosophy, from the Greek word kynikos, meaning dog-like. It was meant as an insult, but Diogenes embraced it. He said, "Yes, I am a dog. I fawn on those who give, bark at those who refuse, and bite scoundrels." To him, being called a dog was a compliment, because dogs live freely, they don't care for gold, status, or fancy robes. They live according to nature. And for Diogenes, that was the essence of philosophy, to live simply, truthfully, and in harmony with nature, unchained by society's illusions. Diogenes' life was his message. He wore rags, carried a wooden bowl, until he saw a boy drinking water with his hands, and threw the bowl away, saying, "A child has beaten me in simplicity." He slept in a large clay jar in the marketplace, ate when hungry, and said whatever he pleased. To others, this looked like madness. But to Diogenes, it was freedom, the only real kind of freedom, the freedom from wanting more. The citizens of Athens found him both hilarious and disturbing. When people asked him what he was doing wandering around the city with a lantern in broad daylight, he replied, "I am looking for an honest man." He never found one. With that single act, he exposed the hypocrisy of society, a city full of philosophers and leaders, yet empty of honesty. He turned philosophy into performance art, a living critique of greed and pretension. One of his most famous encounters was with Alexander the Great. The story goes that the conqueror visited Diogenes, curious to meet this strange philosopher. He found him lying in the sun and asked, "I am Alexander, the great king. Is there anything I can do for you?" Diogenes barely looked at him and said, "Yes, stand out of my sunlight." That moment captures everything about him, his rejection of power, his immunity to flattery, and his deep understanding of what truly matters. Alexander reportedly said, "If I were not Alexander, I would wish to be Diogenes." The king admired the philosopher who feared nothing, not even him. To Diogenes, most people lived like slaves, not because they were chained, but because they were owned by their desires. They craved approval, wealth, comfort, and status. They were prisoners of opinion. He mocked this slavery by exaggerating it. When others hid their weaknesses, Diogenes flaunted his independence. When others boasted of their virtue, he lived his. He didn't talk about rejecting luxury, he did it. He didn't discuss morality, he embodied it. His philosophy was not about theories but about practice. As he once said, "We have complicated every simple gift of the gods." He believed that happiness was not found in possessions or reputation, but in self-sufficiency, what the Greeks called autarkeia. To need little was to be rich. To depend on nothing was to be free. When someone asked him where he was from, he replied, "I am a citizen of the world." In that one line, he became one of the first cosmopolitans, a man who saw all humanity as one, unconcerned with borders or nations. He refused to belong to any particular city or tribe, because he believed the whole world was his home. Diogenes' message still cuts deep today. He lived in an age of materialism and hypocrisy, just like ours. His laughter wasn't cruel, it was revealing. He laughed at those who spent their lives chasing shadows, money, titles, fame, things that disappear as quickly as they come. He asked us to look at the absurdity of it all. Why do we work endlessly to afford luxuries that bring no peace? Why do we care so much about how we appear, instead of who we are? Why do we follow customs that make us miserable, just to please others? Diogenes held up a mirror to society, and what reflected back was both ridiculous and tragic. His confrontation with Plato is legendary. When Plato defined man as a featherless biped, Diogenes plucked a chicken, brought it into Plato's academy, and declared, "Here is Plato's man." The students burst out laughing. Plato had to add, "with broad nails." Behind the joke lies a deeper critique. Diogenes despised empty intellectualism, philosophy that talked about virtue but didn't live it. He believed wisdom wasn't in definitions but in actions, in living honestly and without illusion. Another story tells that when he was seen begging for food from a statue, people mocked him. He said, "I'm practicing disappointment." Even his begging was a form of training the soul to be indifferent to outcomes, to be unshaken by rejection. In that sense, Diogenes was not far from the Stoics who came after him. He anticipated their idea that external things cannot touch our peace unless we let them. But where Stoicism was calm and rational, Diogenes was raw and wild, philosophy stripped to its bare bones. At the heart of his teaching was the belief that virtue is the only true good. Everything else, wealth, beauty, fame, is indifferent. He didn't believe we should just talk about morality, he believed we should become moral through action. That's why he lived like a beggar, not because he wanted pity, but because he wanted to prove that happiness doesn't come from possessions. It comes from independence of soul. He said, "The gods have given us everything we need to be happy, but we've made it all complicated." He also believed in parrhesia, the freedom to speak truth without fear. Diogenes never hesitated to speak his mind, no matter how offensive it was. He used insult as a weapon against corruption and vanity. When a rich man once boasted about his generosity, Diogenes spat in his face and said, "I couldn't find anywhere more suitable." He mocked false virtue and false piety. To him, hypocrisy was the greatest sin, and honesty was the greatest virtue. His death, fittingly, is as uncertain as his life. Some say he died from holding his breath, others that he was bitten by a dog or ate spoiled food. But even in death, his legend grew. He left behind no writings, only stories, actions, and laughter. Yet those stories inspired generations of thinkers, from the Stoics like Epictetus and Seneca to modern rebels who question authority and convention. He proved that you can influence the world not through wealth or armies, but through authenticity, through living your truth so boldly that the world cannot ignore you. In many ways, Diogenes was the first anti-influencer. He didn't want followers, he wanted people to wake up. He didn't build schools, but he built a legacy of freedom. His laughter was not mockery, it was medicine. He laughed because he saw how ridiculous human vanity was. He laughed because truth, when stripped naked, is both terrifying and funny. He laughed because wisdom often hides in simplicity. So what can we learn from Diogenes today? We live in a time when comfort is worshipped, attention is currency, and image is everything. Diogenes would probably laugh harder than ever. But his message would remain the same: simplicity, honesty, and courage are the foundations of a good life. He would remind us that we are not our possessions, not our followers, not our titles. He would tell us to unlearn our dependencies and rediscover the freedom that comes from needing less. He'd walk through our cities, past our glowing screens and luxury stores, holding his lantern high, still searching for an honest person. Maybe he'd find one, maybe not. But he'd keep laughing, because the search itself is what makes life worthwhile. In the end, Diogenes showed that philosophy isn't about talking, it's about living truth without fear. It's about stripping away everything false until only what's real remains. He taught that freedom isn't something granted by society, it's something you create by refusing to be its slave. And perhaps that's why, more than 2,000 years later, his laughter still echoes, mocking our illusions, daring us to be free.